Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So, today we're talking all about your top 5 tips for better blood sugar control. And because I'm a dietitian that works in the PCOS hormone health space, we have a clinic that supports people with metabolic diseases and syndrome and type 2 diabetes and polycystic ovary syndrome, of course. I think because of that, when I go onto TikTok or Instagram, a lot of my algorithm is inundated with tips for things like blood sugar control. Certainly a very trendy topic right now. And I always think of social media, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it's fantastic that there's so much awareness, and I think podcasting falls under that umbrella, right? There's so much information and knowledge accessible to the public. But also, more than ever, I think we need a really critical eye when it comes to consuming and interpreting media, especially health information, because it can be very serious, right? If we're accessing inaccurate information that might be harmful as well. So when it comes to blood sugar, a lot of the content online is a mixed bag. Some's helpful, some's wildly conflicting. But what I see often is a lot of evidence-informed, small tips that are helpful, but the benefits and the effectiveness and impact is vastly inflated, right? So maybe there's something I see online that I'm like, okay, I would tell a client to maybe try this as step 5, 6, or 7, but not necessarily 1, 2, 3, right? Which is really the foundation that's going to make the biggest difference. And it's also just exhausting, I'm sure, for you to try to piece together tiny bits of advice. So in today's episode, I'm going to simplify things. I'm going to share the top 5 tips for better blood sugar control, especially important if you have PCOS. I'm going to clear some myths, and really by following these, you're more likely to experience higher energy levels, reduce the risk for type 2 diabetes, which we know is important goal for PCOS management. And beyond that, managing blood sugars has tons of long-term protective effects, right? So beyond short-term energy and beyond diabetes prevention and management, it's really protecting your cardiovascular health, protecting your blood vessels. It also protects your kidney function, right? And is really helpful for long-term health. And these are strategies that you're going to start or be able to start working towards right away. And these are the same foundations that we actually teach within our 12-week PCOS recovery program, which starts February 18th, so very soon, and is designed to help members in PCOS, people with PCOS, move from reactive eating, shame-based eating, fear-based eating, and energy crashes, missing periods, rising labs, to really feeling more empowered, confident around how to fuel for PCOS, have steadier blood sugars, more predictable cycles, and really just improve their relationship with food and body and feel empowered to take control of their health and well-being, again, through day-to-day choices. Okay, so off to it. My first tip for better blood sugar control is meal timing. And this one is so underrated. It's not just what we eat that matters, it's when. So I'm speaking to you if you're someone who maybe tends to skip breakfast, maybe coffee is your breakfast, or maybe it kind of bleeds into a light brunch type scenario. Maybe you're grazing through the afternoon, you're just heading to the fridge and the pantry, and you're more snackish and peckish throughout the afternoon, and you're kind of eating at kind of random hours of the day. It's really just as a backup last thing to do while work might be your priority. And maybe that's unintentional restriction, or maybe it's intentional restriction. Maybe you're trying to diet, lose weight, you've been told to adhere to, 1,200 calories, right? Or something super low carb. Maybe that leads to a little bit of compulsive or what feels like out of control eating later on, right? And then that's when it feels like the floodgates open and the majority of your food is now backlogged and concentrated to the latter half of the day, right? And if that's someone who's you, just want to say it's not a matter of willpower, it's not a matter of discipline. Oftentimes it's genuine hunger that you're feeling that out of control around food as one of the factors. But what I challenge you to do is to restructure your meal timing. So take a beat, slow down, look at your schedule, and start by simply adding a breakfast routine and more meal routines into your day. And we see the benefit of structure that promotes consistent meal timing, and that mindfulness around eating, and the benefits we see time and time again. We see this in our patients who are comparing their pre and post A1C levels, right? Their average blood sugar readings over 3 months. We see this in patients who are monitoring live blood sugar readings through their continuous glucose monitors. We see the power of this time and time again in our clinical practice. And this is supported by research. So there was a large cross-sectional study of over 7,500 participants that found an earlier eating start time was associated with more favorable metabolic markers. So things like insulin sensitivity and glucose, aka sugar regulation. When we look at the benefits of meal timing and earlier meal times in bodies with PCOS, specifically around stress hormones like cortisol, which we know have a relationship with blood sugar control, studies looking at this have found that eating a protein-containing breakfast within 2 hours of waking is associated with better daily cortisol patterns and more stable energy. And most recently, that last part. Oh, Kayla, if you could just redo that last part. And more recently, a 2024 systematic review looked at meal frequency and time-restricted eating in people with type 2 diabetes, and it found that eating within a 10-hour window, limiting intake and enjoying, so for some it might be limiting intake, for some it might be structuring intake, right, to 3 meals a day and not eating and not skipping breakfast was associated with better glycemic control, right? So what does all of this mean practically for someone with PCOS? It means, rather than heading out the door or heading straight into your workspace and hitting the ground running, stress, we know being busy tends to deplete appetite. Structure your breakfasts, and your gut is a muscle that can be trained to tolerate more food over time. Just like you go to the gym, you train to lift more weights, right? You build strength there. Same with your gut and the muscle and the resilience there. So structure your breakfasts, protein and fiber, aim for consistent lunches, take that time. Or if you have no choice and you really have to eat on the go, or you're working through, a meeting, like that's okay. Or you're working through, writing emails and a report, ensure that it is there and it is complete where we can, right? And if you're someone who tends to eat in a little bit more of a triangle shape, can we slowly move towards more of a square where we're distributing our meals and our food a little bit more consistently throughout the day? So in practice, I'm a huge believer with anchoring the day with a routine, and a huge believer in the power of like a strong start to the morning, even if it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes of you time, and that's when you're kind of setting your intentions for the day, right? It's so simple, yet consistently. Also inside the PCOS recovery program, this is one of the most like game-changing behaviors people report that they feel there's a benefit from in terms of energy levels, digestion, cravings, right? Mood, productivity once they actually implement it. And it's not perfect, just more or less working towards this, more or less consistently as well. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is to dress up your naked carbs by practicing what we call nutrition by addition. So carbs get a really bad reputation in PCOS care. And just to be clear, carbs are not the enemy. The issue is not carbs, right? But it's more the speed in which it gets broken down and absorbed into the bloodstream when they're eaten alone. And actually, I just called it an issue, but let me just retract that word. I wouldn't even call it an issue because in some scenarios, this is actually preferred, right? For example, before exercise, right? You actually want that fast energy and that fast glucose, right? Because that's going to fuel you through your workouts. However, if your intention and goal is to fuel on a Tuesday for the next few hours of work, for the latter half of the day, so you can enter it energized, focused, you're productive, right? You're feeling satiated. You likely want to extend the energy life of that food. And how do we do that? How do we go from a quicker rise in blood sugar and a fall, right? That quick energy to a slower, lower, more controlled rise and fall that's going to give us that lasting energy? We use the nutrition by addition. So instead of cutting carbs, that means we're just adding to it. We're giving ourselves that quick energy we need and then extending it, right? And how do we do that is by adding protein and fat and choosing a fiber-rich carb. So PFF, think PFF is your BFF, protein, fat, fiber. So what does that look like in practice? So maybe you're eating a millet porridge, right? Excellent. There's a little bit of fiber in that carbs. It's going to give you that quick energy you need, right? It's going to fuel your brain. And then maybe you're adding eggs and maybe some steamed vegetables on the side, right? So you're adding some protein, a little bit of fiber, and there's a little bit of fat in the eggs as well. Maybe you're having toast just for breakfast. How do we dress that up? Dress up that naked carb. We're adding some cottage cheese, avocado, maybe we're sprinkling it with some flax seeds. Maybe you're having dal, right? Maybe we're adding some yogurt on top. Maybe we're adding some vegetables on the side, right? If you're having fruit as a snack, you're like, I'm hungry. I had an apple. Oh my goodness, though. I feel like it went right through me. It's just that quick energy. I'm hungry again. Pair it with some nuts, some seeds, some cheese, right? And that's such important things. It better controls your blood sugar, so it slows the glucose absorption. It also makes you feel fuller. Your energy is more stable, right? And it's also going to increase overall nutrition intake. So I love the nutrition by addition approach because it also increases micronutrient intake and helps towards adequacy, right? So minerals that you see all the time, get thrown around, especially in the PCOS space, magnesium, zinc, vitamin C, E, they're all really important to maintain your immunity and health. And one of the best ways is to incorporate more variety, right? Nutrition by addition to make sure you're casting a wider net for your micronutrient intake. All right, so that's tip number 2. Tip number 3 for better blood sugar control is think glycemic load, not just glycemic index. Okay, so I actually don't think I've ever talked about glycemic index on this podcast before, but if you're someone who's in that blood sugar space, you're scrolling, right? You've likely heard this term before. And there's a lot to be said around glycemic index, but what paints a fuller picture of our blood sugars is actually glycemic loads, which takes it a step further. And here is the difference between the two. So glycemic index tells us how fast a carbohydrate raises blood sugar. But glycemic load considers, yes, how fast it raises the blood sugar and how much of this carbohydrate is actually in a portion of the food you're eating. So the glycemic load is much more realistic for real life. And this is actually what we teach in PCOS recovery and in one-on-one because 1, it's more accurate on how your body's going to respond to a certain food and the portion you're eating. And 2, it reduces food fears as well. If you look at the glycemic index list, right, a lot of the high foods, if you're eating it in a portion that you typically would and you're pairing it with protein and fat, a lot of them are actually very nutrient dense and aren't going to spike up your blood sugars in that context. So for example, right, a common one we remove fears around is watermelon, right? You hear watermelon all the time, or we hear it a lot of time in practice, people with PCOS and blood sugar control issues, maybe pre-diabetes, are asking like, can we eat watermelon? I heard it's sugar. I heard it's super sugary. I want to avoid it. So if you look up the list of high glycemic index foods, yes, watermelon does fall under that list. But what's often missed is that when you take into account the carb content per serving, say a cup of watermelon, maybe that's what you're eating, right? It actually has a low glycemic load. Meaning if you have 1 cup of watermelon, it's likely not going to shoot up your blood sugars quickly, right? Especially if you pair it with tip number 2, protein, fat, fiber, right? PFF is your BFF, so we're dressing up those naked carbs. I know it sounds a little bit complex, and I was actually second guessing, to be honest, if I should add it to this episode or not, but I realized, what the heck, let's do it. More information is better. I'm giving some context. If you want more support in this area, of course, because it does get quite nuanced, depends on what portions, what else we're eating the day, of course, the meal timing, then absolutely hit up our team for education or join our one-on-one PCOS recovery or join our PCOS recovery program that's launching in February 18th. Okay, so for today though, instead of memorizing charts on the low glycemic index, etc. foods, the practical takeaways, remember that portion size matters, pairing matters, and context matters. And this approach is far more sustainable and far more effective. And it's a lot more nuanced than just chasing like a low glycemic index label on a food, right? Okay. Tip number 4 is eating enough is part of blood sugar control. And this one often surprises people, as that is important to eat enough, right? We're not restricting, we're not on severe calorie deficits. And this is so surprising because especially in this space, I think a lot of people are taught to less is more, right? Diet, eat less, but that can actually backfire. And it also just doesn't feel very good as well. And here's what's happening is when you don't eat enough. So if you're in a case of, severe energy deficit and low energy availability, over time, your body can actually interpret that as stress, especially if you're listening and you're someone who's high output. A lot of our patients are perfectionists. People with PCOS tend to try really hard, right? Because it's so uncomfortable. And your body's doing a lot without much fuel. There's high output, low input. In response, your cortisol, that stress hormone, can stay high, right? Cortisol itself is actually beneficial and necessary for health, but we don't want it to always stay high and be dysregulated. So think of cortisol's job is to keep fuel available when the body thinks it's under threat, whether it's fight or flight mode, whether you're, being chased by a bear, right? Or it's in this scenario where you're in like kind of the modern day threats here in North America of just the wear and tear of everyday life, right? It does that by making insulin less effective and by encouraging the liver to release more glucose, aka sugar, into your bloodstream. And the intent there is to give you more energy to handle this external threat. So even though you're eating less, your blood sugar levels in these scenarios can actually become less stable. And that's why undereating over time is linked to higher cortisol, stronger cravings, to blood sugar crashes followed by rebounds, right? And this effect can be amplified if you're super active, you're chronically stressed, maybe you're postpartum, you're sleeping poorly, and you're just overall, once again, a high output individual. So blood sugar regulation does depend also on adequate energy availability. So the structured regular meals, sufficient carbohydrates, you're pairing with protein, fat, right? You're choosing more high fiber carbs, and eating enough actually sends a powerful signal to your body that it's safe, right? And safe bodies tend to regulate better, period. So you want your body to be safe. You don't want it to be under a state of stress, right? And you can tell yourself, body, hey, I'm okay now. Right? Eating enough also just protects lean muscle, your brain, really bone health. And that's why, in PCOS care, we don't actually start with restrictions. We start with nourishment and ensuring you're eating enough to fuel your body. Okay, so that's tip number 4. And last but not least, tip number 5 for better blood sugar control is movement, sleep, and nervous system support. And bonus, I also want to name genetics and environment because, Excuse me. I also want to name genetics and environment because sometimes we can, quote unquote, perfect, even though there's no perfect, really work towards, what we can modify in terms of our lifestyle and intake. But there are real barriers that are non-medical factors that are outside, right? So genetics, environment, can we access care? Are we safe in a safe physical built environment? Can we access food, right? So I do also want to acknowledge that. But when it comes to things that we can more or less are more within our locus of control, beyond nutrition, it's exercise, sleep practices. Are we managing our stress load, right? Or is it through the roof, right? Because all of these play a role in your blood sugar. I don't want to frame nutrition as the be all end all in medicine because our bodies are so much more complicated, even as a dietitian, right? I acknowledge that. So exercise improves insulin sensitivity by helping muscles take up glucose, right? And this is well supported by both what we know, exercise physiology and PCOS specific studies. So the recommended guidelines are 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous weekly activity with at least 2 times a week of weight bearing sessions, right? So aim for this if sedentary. If you want to work with a personal trainer who's going to help you actually come up with a safe plan, a structured plan, right? Who I do reach out. We have fantastic ones in our network that can work with clients both virtually and in person located in Toronto. So reach out if you need referrals for that, but we strongly, strongly recommend. I also want to say more on a side note is for PCOS, there is a huge myth that vigorous exercise, high intensity exercise should be avoided. It is not true. It is more about managing the stress load. So yes, if we're overdoing high intensity exercise, especially when we're underfueled or we're sleep deprived or we're working a really stressful job, right, this can backfire because cortisol levels, the stress load can just be too high. And in that case, the natural rise in cortisol that happens after exercise may not reduce, right? And this can worsen glucose variability and really increase the glucose levels. So that's the challenge, isn't to avoid vigorous exercise. It's more, exercise is great for you on its own. It's more big picture and context, right? Are you supporting yourself with enough fuel, preparation, recovery time, right? Are we managing our overall stress load? Now, sleep, I also want to touch upon because sleep deprivation alone is enough to increase blood sugars. And remember, our body is doing tons of repair and recovery overnight. So sleep is essential, right? It's when your body's recovering. And it's also when your gut does its housekeeping. So if you're feeling bloated, constipated, sleep deprivation is actually one of those not so obvious factors that sometimes plays a role as well. And we need to restore and refresh ourselves, right, to meet the demands of the day. We know that sleep deprivation can increase cortisol levels, raise fasting blood sugars, and is even linked to worsened post-meal glucose control, right? So for people with PCOS, poor sleep compounds that underlying condition and can actually worsen a lot of the symptoms. So I know I just said, nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress resilience, I'm acknowledging social determinants of health, right? Not to overwhelm you, because I also want to just end off with a reminder that there's no such thing as a perfect balance. It is truly impossible to balance it all. Different seasons of life, different areas that require a little bit more love, a little bit more intention, right? And there's different barriers that come, right? So rather than feel like you have to perfect it all, I encourage you to just do a daily, monthly, weekly reflection. What am I capable of today? Which areas of these pillars of my health need a little bit more love, need a little bit more support? What do I have capacity for today, right? And where can I meet myself where I'm at to support my well-being? And what does that look like right now? And really by focusing on these small practices bit by bit, right, it makes a great change over time as well. Okay. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this episode, it's that better blood sugar control with PCOS doesn't come from necessarily doing more and more and more of those hacks. It's really getting the foundations right. So regular, well-timed meals, eating enough to manage our body's needs, right? And meet our body's high demands. Pairing carbs with protein and fat, movement, sleep, nervous system care. So when these pieces are in place, your body can slowly learn to regulate more smoothly. And if you're listening and you're thinking, okay, this makes sense, it's a lot, I need help implementing it, I need a little bit more context, I need a little bit more support, right? That's exactly what we do inside our 12-week PCOS recovery program. We take these principles and help you apply them in real life, with education, with tools, with bi-weekly coaching support. And our next cohort starts February 18th. And you can find details in the show notes. So whether you're taking one step from this episode or seeking more structured support, know that your body's broken. There are always small different ways to better support your well-being. Okay, so hope to see you at the next cohort of PCOS recovery. Hope to see you next in 2 weeks, which is when our next podcast episode is dropping, and reach out if you need anything. Have a good one.